And today, we're very glad to invite Keith Wallace to share his experience with Yishu Journal. Keith Wallace has been a curator of contemporary art since 1979. From 1991 to 1994, he was curator of the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver, Canada, and from 1994 to 2001 as the director and curator, where he developed a program of regional, national, and international exhibitions. He has been a supporter of artist-run centers and wrote a history of Vancouver ARCs for Vancouver Anthologies in 1991 and edited Whispered Art History in 1993, celebrating 20 years of the Western Front, one of Canada's longest-running ARCs. In 2004, he organized InFest, International Artist-Run Culture, that brought together 250 artists and administrators from 25 countries. He was associate director and curator at the Morris and Helen Belkin Art Gallery at the University of British Columbia from 2004 to 2008, and from 2012 to 2015. From 2004 to 2020, Keith Wallace was the editor-in-chief of Yishu, Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art. You have a very impressive biography. So now let's welcome Keith Wallace to share with us his personal experience with Yishu Journal. Keith, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good evening, wherever you may be. I would first of all like to thank Carol and UC and Wenlong and the Inside Out Art Museum for the work they've done and for including us as part of their programming. I also want to acknowledge Ken Lum as the founding editor of Yishu and Zheng Cheng Tian as a co-founder, and also the staff that I've worked with, Julie Grunwig, Kate Steinman, Chun-Yi Lee, Laura Broyd, and also to Katie Shin of Artco Limited in Taipei, who has been a long-time supporter of the publication, and you know how much we appreciate her and love her for her support and the work that she does. So now this presentation, which is called What China, is a revised version of a lecture that I gave at the University of Lisbon in 2015. And I'm presenting it here because it gives an overview of some of the things that I was thinking about as editor-in-chief of Yishu during close to 17 years. And by the way, if my eyes go down, I'm looking at notes, so I'm note dependent. I hope you'll forgive me. My background is as a curator of contemporary art, as you mentioned, and while I had exhibited a number of artists of Chinese descent, contemporary Chinese art was not a main aspect of my work. However, in 2004, I received a phone call from the managing editor, Zheng Cheng Tian, one of the most internationally respected all-round scholars of Chinese art. He asked if I would consider taking on the role of editor-in-chief and follow the lead of the founding editor, Ken Lum, who produced the first 6 issues. My first response actually was, why me? Because I had never even been to China at that time. But in the end, I have been editor-in-chief for 94 issues. And the issue on the screen right now is the first issue, and this is the most recent 100 issue. So my interpretation of Zheng Cheng Tian's invitation at the time was that an outside perspective could be of value. And this is not to suggest that this outside perspective is in any way authoritative, but that it carries with it a certain kind of objectivity, and that I wasn't involved in the Chinese art scene. I didn't really have any kind of political or career agenda within it. In any case, after thinking about it, aside from the content that I would be faced with, I deduced that editing a journal was actually not so different from curating an exhibition, other than the result being different in form, one being textual, the other visual. So I thought, well, why not try it? It would be an opportunity for me to learn something new in an area of contemporary art that held some interest for me. And that was at the time relatively new territory internationally. I'm not referencing Yishu in this talk as a promotional platform, but as something that has served as the vehicle for developing my own knowledge growth within this field. So this talk is going to be a little bit like a story. And it's actually mystified me that only once have I been asked to define what is meant by the word Chinese in the publication subtitle, Contemporary Chinese Art, as though Chinese had some universal application. Well, I must confess that this is somewhat a relief that this question has not come to me frequently. It is at the same time one that has constantly occupied my mind, and that I've come to realize to some extent this question and an exploration of it is an underlying element that has driven much of the content of the journal. One thing that has become increasingly clear to me is that the Chinese and contemporary Chinese art has indeed become a generalization that sidesteps acknowledgement of the differing and at times contradictory histories, not only within the geographic realm of what constitutes Greater China, that being mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, but also its extensive diaspora. The connections or affiliations among these various manifestations of China are not always evident or obvious. And in effect, each has its own history, aesthetic concerns, and cultural ecology. The history of contemporary art in Taiwan is not parallel to that of mainland China. And I've come across curators in Beijing who profess to having relatively little knowledge about art being made, for example, in Hong Kong. The idea of independence exercised by Hong Kong and Taiwan in their relationship to mainland China has resulted in a longer, more evolutionary trail of perspectives and strategies within writing on art that reflect a distinct identity, as fraught as it currently is. I believe that we, as writers and historians, need to be more vigilant in acknowledging these differences and how we qualify what constitutes China. I am not sure from where the contemporary designation of the idea of Greater China emerged. Its usage does go back to the 1930s as a way to identify territories once claimed by China, some of them the same today and some different. More recently, Greater China has been used as an indicator of growing economic and corporate ties between mainland China and Hong Kong and now Taiwan. Ties that potentially have embedded within them political agendas. Issues of sovereignty can become modeled within the process of economic trade-offs. Within the art world, the designation of Greater China is coming into more common use and has its own nuances. During the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s, mainland China dominated attention within the realm of contemporary Chinese art in Greater China and beyond, which not only had to do with its aggressive economic boom, but also with the world's fascination towards a nation that has shifted so dramatically from a communist entity under the euphemistic to one that's embraced capitalism under a euphemistic one-party rule, and whose presence is ubiquitous within each and every one of us in our daily lives, from the clothes we wear to the food we eat, the tools we work with, and the electronics we listen to, on and on. And while art from mainland China is exported internationally, much like its products, relatively little international art has made its way into China, aside from biennials and art fairs, and now the increasing presence of private and internationally franchised art museums, such as the Louvre in Shanghai. Art from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and especially Macau, culturally seem to hover uncomfortably in the background of mainland China during the final years of the 20th century and the first years of the 21st century. But in recent years, Taiwan, with the introduction of the Taipei Biennial in 1984, and in 1995, the Taiwan Pavilion for the Venice Biennale, which was only the second Asian pavilion after Japan, and then followed by the Hong Kong Pavilion, and then mainland China, which opened in 2005. That's for the Venice Biennale. So they've reasserted their presence, and in terms of visual art, mainland China cannot really adequately serve as the, quote, in quotation marks, the representative of China. Indeed, outside of the context of a domestic market, an arena mainland China continues to dominate. Hong Kong has gained a strong foothold in its efforts to be another center of Chinese art, not only with Art Basel Hong Kong, but with its ambitious program of museum building, for example, M+, which I believe is to open this year, and being the, sort of the main generators of this growth in Hong Kong. There are many private art galleries that have opened and auction houses such as Sotheby's and Christie's. I'm just going to, this is the Art Basel Hong Kong, the works by Gu Wenda and Ai Weiwei, very popular, huge lineups to go into it. It has been very successful, of course, with COVID this year. It has been postponed. So I've introduced some of the complexity inherent in attempting to describe, discuss, or even more of a challenge, define Chinese art. Entering into this hazy realm are issues as varied as nationhood, political will, territorial borders, ethnicity, globalization, migration, and cultural investment. Moving outside of Greater China to a place like Vancouver, where I was brought up and continue to live, is but one example of many that brings into play another kind of complexity of what the idea of China is. From the migration to Canada in the mid-19th century of Chinese from Guangdong province, who were brought to work in mining camps during the gold rush, and later in providing cheap labor to complete the transnational railroad, to a third wave of migration after World War II, following the elimination of the head tax. And this was a tax to discourage immigration from Asia, and then an outright ban on Chinese immigration, to the exodus from Hong Kong prior to the 1997 takeover by mainland China. And then there was a wave in the 1990s and 2000s of Taiwanese immigrants, to the largest population now arriving, which is from mainland China. And mainland China and Vancouver is not just an example of one of the many Chinatowns in the world. Oh, there's M+. Sorry, I'm not doing my slides very well. This is China in 1904, a Chinatown in Vancouver. This, where many of these left, okay. So mainland China is not just an example of one of the many Chinatowns around the world. But remains directly connected to the motherland. Many of these new immigrants from mainland China have not entirely left mainland China. They have homes in both locations. At times, the mother and children live in Vancouver, while the husband takes care of business back in the mainland. This temporal and geographical layering brings together the earlier, more historical Cantonese language and culture with the more recent Mandarin, which is threatening to replace the once dominant Cantonese language in Vancouver, a situation in which often one does not seamlessly comprehend the other. That is before Mandarin became popular in Hong Kong, for example. Many of the immigrants that came to Vancouver came prior to that. So for me, China was present in Vancouver long before my birth. But in its waves of immigration, the question of what China has always been present in my experience. What is it? Is it a real China or a simulated China within a Western context? If the Chinese experience in Vancouver is reflective of the Chinese who live here, is it not then, in its own way, an expression of China? This challenge of what defines China, especially within the larger demographic context, slips into the realms of identity, both self-identity and identity as understood from the outside. This inevitably leads to ideas of the cross-cultural, but the cross-cultural often gets spoken of as though it is some new or recent evolution that is the offspring of contemporary globalization, which it is not. Globalization has been unraveling for a very long time through cross-border trade routes, the Silk Road being a prime example, and the tentacular reaches of colonization. China has been cross-cultural for centuries. Oh, this is Aberdeen Mall in Richmond. Sorry about my, this is very much of an Asian mall that was built in Richmond, which is outside of Vancouver. And here we're in Kerala, India, where there are Chinese fishing nets. And then there is the Uyghurs in the northwest part of China, which have a Turkish descent as well as a Chinese descent. And then there's Portuguese, the Portuguese who came to Macau. So there's Portuguese. So there's like this globalization that happened way, way long ago. So while mainland China has a history that clearly identifies it as China within a geopolitical sense, China as a concept is no longer geographical, political, ethnic, or racial. So what China? Australian art historian Jeremy Barmay, whose work has been on the minds of many for some years, has suggested in his ideas around the new sinology that we must consider China from myriad perspectives of history, culture, language, migration, geopolitics, and through both theoretical and personal accounts. So I have, in my role as editor-in-chief, looked at some of these issues that complicate the idea of what is China within a contemporary context through personal experience, not only through growing up in a city that has had a contentious and increasingly engaged relationship with China and Asia as a whole, and is now noticeably Asian in its demographics, but perhaps more so through the example of my work with Yishu, Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art. I'm going to provide a few examples of how we at Yishu approach the idea of China and use the publication to interrogate definitions and cultural constructs of what China might be. In some texts we have published, China is not even mentioned. Now, I will likely dig myself into some awkward holes, but I am not here to provide you with neatly packaged answers, but to offer some perhaps problematic propositions that even in my agreeing to publish certain texts, I have not myself resolved. With this preface, I'm not going to attempt a definition of what is Chinese. Not being Chinese, I'm not qualified to attempt it. In any case, I'm not sure it can be defined. So again, I'm thinking of the idea of China on a more conceptual, but also practical level, and I'm exploring how it potentially seeps into so many aspects of the world. Even within Greater China itself, one finds the aforementioned differences between mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau, and within mainland China itself, there are all the various ethnicities, some 56 of them, even though the Han comprise over 90% of the population. And this is a Cultural Revolution propaganda poster showing the ethnic diversity in China. And this is the Beijing Olympic opening ceremonies, which again is showing the ethnic diversity. So this is all part of a bigger socio-political picture. And within visual art, each of these regions have different histories. Whose work can be considered Chinese? If Chinese aesthetics or iconography or philosophy enters into the artwork, does that render it Chinese? What is authentic? How do Chinese tropes and emblems and icons and aesthetics and mark making go beyond ethnicity, cultural entitlement, or territorial borders? What does it mean to be Chinese with an extensive history in another country? Indonesia, India, Singapore, Canada, or Australia, for example. And aside from the issue of the diaspora, what is the relationship of Greater China with the rest of Asia? So, when I started working with Yishu, what did I think was China? The 6 issues that preceded my involvement offered a rich variety of perspectives on Chinese art. Yishu originally considered itself a kind of academic journal, although it was not peer-reviewed, but my vision was to open it up to as many voices as possible, for people to approach us when they had something they really wanted to talk about. Thus, we published well-known academics as well as young writers that we helped to mentor. This may reveal a weakness in terms of focus, and I admit some of the published issues might not be as strong as others, but I do believe that the openness of our attitude has found us entering territories other publications, especially those that are more deeply embedded within the concerns of the art market, have not. So, what China? Among my first encounters where I had to question what is China came with 2 texts that were simultaneously submitted to Yishu in 2006, one in the work of artist Michael Cherney, the other on Robert Majles. Cherney is a photographer who has made works, and this is his piece here on the screen, of art that focus on images of China and are presented in a traditional Chinese accordion style fold album, and not from the perspective of a documentarian, but as an observer who, through an exploration of photographic processes, offers poetic fragments of the extended time he spent in China. Majles, on the other hand, works with text and mixes English and Hebrew letters with Chinese characters that emphasize the differences between these languages while simultaneously integrating them through poetry. At times, legibility emerges, and at times it slips into abstraction. My hesitation in publishing these texts arose from the fact that this was the first instance that Yishu presented work by non-Chinese artists that contained Chinese content. But it was also, for me, coming from North America and having experienced the often heated debates in the 1990s over identity politics and cultural appropriation, and these debates occurred over who had the right to represent what, many artists were adamant that only an artist of a particular ethnicity or race could represent that ethnicity or race, or even the cultural characteristics they represented. And attempts by those on the outside would be deemed misled and authentic gestures. So I had to determine what these 2 artists were endeavoring in their representations of China. But neither Cherney nor Majles were intending to represent China or presumed to be Chinese in any way. Instead, their work was more of a kind of research that drew its content from Chinese iconography and language. Majles in particular was bringing the Chinese language into a larger discourse by presenting it in relation to other languages and their communication systems. This decision led to other instances of presenting non-Chinese artists in the pages of Yishu. Thai artist Navin Robin Chaikol's 2009 exhibition Super China at Olin's Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, in which he examined both the complex interpersonal relationships within the Chinese art world, as well as appropriated the idea of Mao's Little Red Book with one that contains Robin Chaikol's own quotations. This exhibition included the Monopoly-like board game with art world gamblings at stake and a 12-meter mural with portraits of those in the art world hierarchy who the artist considered it is necessary to know in order to advance one's artistic career. This exhibition was a kind of ongoing commentary on an art system, in this case, the meteoric rise of mainland China's art market that Robin Chaikal has confronted in his own experience as an artist. One thing that interested me here is that it was an artist from Asia making this comment and not one from the West, something I will return to later. And by the way, Robin Chaikal's distribution of his quotations from Chairman Navin to the public resulted in his arrest. An interview we published between Stephanie Bailey and the collective Slavs and Tatars looked at Turkish language politics, its evolution, and its connection to the Uyghurs of Xinjiang and Northwest China, and extends back to the Silk Route. In another exhibition, Shahzad Dawood, who was the first non-Chinese artist to exhibit at OCAT Xi'an, he brings up the idea of showing his film Piercing Brightness, a film made by a non-Chinese artist about the Chinese diaspora in Preston, UK, England, a place quite likely alien to most of those who live in Xi'an and how it might be received in China. He also produced a film about Xi'an that explored its past, present, and future, and its proximity to borders and confluences, a thematic that ties into his interest in cultural hybridity. What I felt was important about all these artists was that they're making a contribution to China understanding itself and its histories through perspectives from, as I alluded to earlier, the outside. So, again, what China? All of this begins an expansive discourse that introduces aspects of China that are not always included in the standard narratives that represent contemporary Chinese art. Another example, and here it reverses the narrative somewhat, is the work of Indian artist Loretti Joyce Pinto, whose drawings and prints allude to the thirst of China for iron ore and the agreements for illegal mining extraction arranged by Indian mining families. This has had a huge impact on communities in the vicinity of Goa, India, a tourist mecca with endless beaches and historic colonial Portuguese architecture in which open pit mines scar the landscape and water resources that have now been compromised. This issue segues into artists who represent the vast Chinese diaspora, or I should say diasporas. This constitutes another highly complex component of what China? Is it China by default? Do the Chinese of the diasporas have more of a claim to China because of their ethnicity than those non-Chinese artists we have discussed? Let's consider its complexity. There were those who were born in China and left during the Cultural Revolution, and whose work evolved into a mix of Chinese and Western influences as they tried to find a footing in another culture. These artists maintained aesthetic aspects of their education in mainland China, but also incorporated ideas from the West that were prevalent at the times. Examples include a number of artists such as Feng Cheng-rui and Ming Fei, who settled on the west coast of North America and in New York, and other artists went to many other cities in North America and Australia and Europe. Many of these artists were well known in the West through the 1950s and 1960s, but after the opening up of mainland China, following the demise of the Cultural Revolution, all attention moved to Asia. Because of their hybrid aesthetic, these artists never really entered the mainstream in either continent, but in recent years have been receiving new attention as scholars and historians dig more deeply into Chinese histories that extend beyond Greater China in an effort to understand China in its many permutations. Then there are those who left mainland China just before or after 1989 and who maintain strong, though at times indirect references to China as ciphers within their artwork. Among these artists are Huang Yongping, Chen Zhen, Xu Bing, Guwenda, and Saigo Chang. This image isn't of Saigo Chang. Well, some of these artists have been accused of culturally capitalizing on work that flaunts its Chineseness as a requisite to quench the thirst of those who want work by Chinese artists that is easily identifiable as Chinese. In many respects, such accusations are unfair and perhaps better reflect a globalized market agenda rather than artists drawing upon the iconography that represents signs derived from the majority of their lived experience. After all, if one moves to a different country, does one abandon one's past? So, again, what China, where? Then there are those who are born in mainland China or Hong Kong or Taiwan and immigrated to the West in their youth. So their experience is even more of a hybrid mix of East and West, in that they do not feel they have to be representatives of China. And having arrived at a young age, they are more naturalized and comfortable with assimilation into the West. In Canada, there are artists such as Ed Pien, who's here, Will Kwon, Howie Sui, and then there are artists. And then there were those artists whose parents and grandparents emigrated from China, and so were born outside of China and may never have even been to China, but who still identify themselves as Chinese in some way and who are given hyphenated identities, for example, Chinese Canadian or Asian American. Again, this was a big issue during the 1990s era of identity politics and the critiques of colonial-like multicultural policies. While most of the work produced by these artists carry little reference to China, they have in some way and at some point reinvested their artwork with Chinese content in an attempt to recuperate something they felt was suppressed by their Western upbringing and that did not fall neatly into Western aesthetic trends. And perhaps there is a bit of a reversal here in that from their experience, they, as artists, are asking as well, what China? Examples here include William Yang, who's in this image, Paul Wong, who's a Vancouver artist, and of course Ken Lum, the founding editor of Yishu. And in the US, there's Rutherford Chang. The difference in experience among these various generations has resulted in work that is equally diverse and nuanced according to each. It is the latter, however, who were not born in China, who might receive the least acknowledgement of authenticity from the stakeholders in Greater China, as the diasporic claim to Chineseness may have little to do with the issues that concern the nations of Greater China. And the latter situation is not only the case with the West, it is equally true for Asian nations such as Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand, where the diaspora evolved in different ways and different waves. There are artists of Chinese descent in these nations who also experience a hybrid existence of living in a nation outside of China, and again, who may not have been born in China, but who are nonetheless considered Chinese within their own nation. The experience of FX Harnoso and his family in Indonesia, for example, was traumatic, as under Suharto's regime from the 1960s into the late 90s, Chinese media was shut down. Chinese schools and organizations were closed. The use of the Chinese language was forbidden. Thus, the Chinese in Indonesia were forced to deny their Chinese identity by changing their names, signing documents disavowing any connection to mainland China and renouncing their Chinese nationality, while still wearing the mantle of Chineseness and thus not being genuine Indonesians. Though of a younger generation, the family of artist Tintin Wulia experienced similar indignities in having to carry proof of citizenship papers and not having grown up in an openly Chinese culture in one installation consisting of 140 international passports. Tintin Wulia undermines the idea of a state-imposed Chineseness by the suggestion of becoming a citizen of the world. And now to return to Greater China itself, this leads to me to something that has been on my mind for some time, the too frequently explored binary between the East and the West, in particular in the context of mainland China. One can't really argue against the influence of the Chinese, or sort of the influence of the West upon contemporary mainland Chinese art, especially during the 1980s and 1990s, when information from the West was flooding in, and Western curators and collectors, aside from the Japanese and those in Taiwan and Hong Kong, were really the first to take interest in mainland Chinese art. There was, at the same time, a desire on the part of many artists to be recognized within the Western art system. In another sense, this binary is not unexpected or unnatural, as so many scholars and art historians who are studying China come from the West. Nevertheless, it has been to the detriment of China's relationship with the rest of Asia, and through Yishu, I was very interested in exploring this. A number of times we published texts or special issues about Greater China's relationship with other nations. Within the context of, for example, the Guggenheim Museum's Asian Art Council, the World Biennial Foundation, we did a special issue with them, the Asia Art Archive Conference, History in Asia, Construction, Exhibitions in the Making of Recent Art History in Asia, we did a special issue with them, or the Long March Project's exploration of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The representation of artists from Greater China also has been examined in respect to international biennials outside of China, such as those in Venice, Istanbul, Auckland, Singapore, Brisbane, Lyon, Yokohama, and Sharjah. A special issue on artist-initiated institutions. Oh, this is the Asia Art Archive cover. Okay. So a special issue, this is the cover of the special issue, edited by Bill Yanis-Chirek. It's on artist-initiated institutions across Asia, and it included essays about Vietnam, the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and India, and really discussed how China might fit or not into that configuration. The intention was not to assume that China somehow automatically has similarities with these other nations, but that they each have their own specificities, much like Greater China itself, and that it would place our understanding of all of them within a broader social, historical, cultural, and geopolitical context, something we can all learn from. Again, this idea of bringing the outside into play in order to understand the inside is something that redirects attention away from the anxieties inherent in the East-West binary. There was also panel discussion, global claims, local effects, that brought China into dialogue with Korea, the Soviet Union, and Turkey. So I'm coming to a close of my long-winded talk and acknowledge that I have no means covered all potential angles. There are other things that nudge at the question, what China? Such as artists who work outside of the mainstream and the market, and who bring into question how their work might fit into the history of contemporary Chinese art. And there are also those artists such as Li Mu, who did these artworks in a small village, and Jin Li, an artist who recently passed away, who are not based in major urban centers, but in small cities or even villages, and whose work is immersed in a kind of microcultural ecology that is difficult to categorize within the massive art industry that is so dominant today. Much of what I've been identifying might seem obvious, perhaps even taken for granted. We seem as though we were done with identity politics years ago, but with incidents such as the street demonstrations in Hong Kong, the transnational movement of so many artists, and the volatility of international markets, both art and otherwise, reconsidering these distinctions of what China may have a renewed resonance. So when we think about China, do we think about geographies, political systems, culture, ethnicity, race? I believe it is about all of them, and in no particular order. This is not to negate the specificities of art in each region or context of Greater China, or to deny mainland China as the mother of China, but instead to see China as an exemplar of where the world is increasingly heading in terms of cultures migrating, adapting, and hybridizing. There is no turning back to an authentic culture or nation in historical terms. So what is an authentic China in this era of neoliberal globalization, where any sense of authenticity is subsumed into homogenization and corporatized agendas? And what is an authentic China when one considers the vast political, social, cultural, and economic shifts that mainland China itself has experienced over the past century? The idea of China is perhaps the most diverse of any idea of any nation, but perhaps it sets in motion the urgency to question the idea of any nation, to try and understand oneself by trying to understand others, to try and understand oneself by trying to understand how others understand us. As the world shifts and nations become increasingly intertwined and interdependent, this idea will be one that is never static. And the idea of what China will always remain a question. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith. It's a very constructive speech, and you gave us a broader perspective of what contemporary Chinese art is. We have prepared a few questions for you. Meanwhile, if any audience has questions, please post it in the chat box. So we were going to have some questions about your observations of contemporary Chinese art, and also some questions about art writing. So let's go back to the 100 issue, the D100s issue, which gave us the opportunity to do this retrospective exhibition. So in issue 100, you posed a question to the writer, and we'd like to ask your thoughts on this question. What are the most significant developments that have taken place in contemporary Chinese art in the past 2 decades in terms of the art produced and system it functions within?
Oh gosh, that's a big question that I posed to all these other writers, and they all responded in different ways. I think that the biggest development is the entry of contemporary Chinese art into the larger international world, and how it took place and why it took place, and how it evolved over the decades. And that's covered quite widely in issue number 100. But as I say, I think that that's probably the most important aspect of it, and to think about what's been referred to as the global and the local, and how the artwork fits within that or doesn't fit within that. I think that the art world is just overall so incredibly diverse these days, and China has definitely created space for itself, and it is constantly evolving, as all artwork in all nations are.
Thank you. And following that, what are your thoughts regarding the situation of contemporary Chinese art today? And with this question, I also want to add Sophia's kids question. on why do you think Chinese contemporary art has been more successful as a Chinese cultural export than other Chinese cultural products?
That has to do with the market. I mean, the market was like in the early 2000s, what was going on with the market. And I think as Karen Smith has pointed out, when contemporary Chinese art, I think it was in 2006, was being sold at auction in New York, the prices absolutely skyrocketed for it. And so it became very desirable. And then the auction houses started to open up in China. And it really did become an investment. I'm not so sure that it still is. I think we kind of step beyond that, especially with COVID. I mean, although I think the auction houses are doing quite well these days, you know, COVID's created a kind of different circumstance for the distribution of art.
And so over the past years, has there been a shift of directions in Yishu Journal?
A shift in directions?
Yeah.
Well, I left at the end of 2020, and I think this is an opportune time to welcome the two new executive editors, Rebecca Catching, who lives in Toronto, and Diana Frindle, who lives in Vancouver, and who they are going to take on the mantle of Yishu, and it will go in a slightly different direction, but I think it's also going to, you know, keep some of its heritage and legacy. So I think it's up to them to really decide where the direction is to be and which way it is to go. I felt after 17 years, it was like timely for me to step back and to let other voices come into play. And I'm very pleased, they'll be great.
So what kinds of writing do Yishu expect? Not in terms of the topics or the length of writing. We know Yishu is very open on this, but what are the most important qualities you are looking for?
Clarity. I like clear writing. I don't like a lot of jargony writing. And I've had, I would say, a good relationship with the writers. And I'm not looking for any topics. As I said, I really, in the past, Yishu has been a place where people can voice themselves and perhaps don't have an opportunity in with other publications to voice themselves. And we have taken on a lot of topics that many other publications don't do. So clarity, I guess, is the thing, because, you know, our readership is international. And a lot of our readers, English is not their first language, even though it's an English language publication. So it's important for me that the writing be as clear and as sort of kind of universal as possible, so it becomes accessible. I just believe it's important that people need to communicate and communicate their ideas. And I didn't want the readers to get bogged down in jargon or language.
So at Art Basel Hong Kong in 2018, you were in a public talk with other editors from Asia, and you discussed the difference between art criticism and your critical writing, and you also showed your reversed opinion about negative art review. Could you elaborate a little bit today?
Well, yeah, I mean, art criticism, I think, is generally in the popular medium or media, in terms of magazines and newspapers, etc. Our criticism is generally fairly short. With Yishu, our reviews were never below 1,500 words, and they would often go up to 4,000 words. So our reviews became more like articles, and that's where critical writing comes into place, I think, because critical writing is more analytical. It's less about judgment, which art criticism is often, somebody writes a critique of an exhibition, there's often an opinion or a stand that's taken. With critical writing, it's more about discourse, and it's more about, it's in a sense less about the writer and more about the content. When a writer is starting to make judgments, then it becomes more about the writer than what it is they're judging at times. So yeah, that's sort of where some of the differences lie. What was the second part of the question?
How's your opinion about negative reviews?
Oh, negative. Well, if somebody's making a negative, if somebody's making any kind of opinion or statement, it has to be backed up with something. And it can't be about personal likes or dislikes. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in, you have an opinion about something. If something's not working in an artwork or an exhibition, why is that? And it doesn't, negative doesn't have to be negative. It can be constructive. And I believe myself that criticism needs to be constructive, and that it's something that we can learn from rather than making judgments. I'm not interested in judgments.
Thank you. And in what ways do you think Yishu Journal distinguishes itself from other art publications and journals? And what do you think is so particularistic about it?
I think that Yishu has had a kind of independence. And, Katie Sheen from Marco has been amazing because she's supported us, for all these years, and has never, made any editorial demands. We have had this editorial freedom that has been so beautiful, and that I really have appreciated. And I think it's one thing, we don't really have ads. Our funding has come from private individuals. So we have very few ads. So we're not reliant on people who take out ads in your publication. And we're not reliant on state funding. We have gotten no state funding in the past. Maybe we will in the future, I don't know. But so it's this kind of independence and freedom that has really, I think, set Yishu apart. And allowing these different voices to come into play, and not necessarily following only what's like trendy or of the moment. That's not so interesting either. We do deal with the present, but really, in my mind, it's always been about the future, and that the publication is there for future research. It's like our main subscribers are libraries and universities and museums. So it's not necessarily a throwaway magazine, like you go and buy a magazine and you read it and then it goes into the garbage. Our publication actually gets kept and it gets used. And we have an extensive archive of almost 15,000 essays online that people can access. So it is really there as making history and a research tool.
And everything now is digital. Like we're having this Zoom because libraries are closed. Many of the libraries are closed, which is a shame. And thinking about like digital, what challenges and opportunities do you think social media and web posting have to art writing and readership? We are especially thinking about in mainland China, where WeChat has become the dominant reading platform and almost like a social monopoly regarding like content production and consumption. Do you read them?
Sometimes, but I'm not interested. Everything's becoming shorter. It seems like everything's with Instagram and Twitter, etc. Everything's becoming shorter, and I've never thought that shorter is better. In fact, I would say that many of our texts became longer over the years. Usually the average was around 3,000 or 4,000 words. Now we have text going up to 12,000 words. And, you know, I do think that social media is important, and I think the website is important. And, you know, I think that Yishu, leave it up to the new people coming in, will probably have a larger presence on the web. But we have kept the hard copy because it's really nice to read a book and turn pages, etc., and not look at a screen.
I couldn't agree more on the physicality of the book. And in the process of editing, what do you enjoy or benefit the most from? You know, and also this Tuesday, which is our Wednesday here, you and the incoming executive editor, Rebecca Catching, had a conversation with ICA Canada on critical writing. And we, and I believe many of our audience today are all striving and struggling with writing. Could you give some advice, and especially to as young and less experienced writers?
I think to be honest to your own voice. I mean, the writing process is the writing process, and it's difficult. I've done a lot of writing, and I always find it difficult. But I also look for clarity. But I think it's like, it's the voice. If you have something to say, and I'll say like one text that I think I mentioned this with Rebecca, one aspect that I've had problems with in the past is where a writer will use too many endnotes. And I've had texts come in where there's an endnote with every sentence. And so I sort of start feeling that that writer's becoming reliant on the voices of others rather than their own voice. And I have to get back to them and say, you know, what do you think? Like, yes, you can acknowledge that you have read different people, but like in the end, what do you think? What do you want to say? And that's, to me, that's the most important thing. And not to be overly self-conscious about writing for somebody. I mean, you have to think about who you're writing for in terms of an audience, but you know, as I say, in certain cases, and it's often been students within PhD students or MFA students, and I sort of felt like they were writing for their professor and having to prove something, and you don't have to. You can just be honest and say what it is you want to say.
And on the very top of our chat box, we have many questions from the audience, and also from Sophia. She asks, what are some of the most unique insights Yishu has been able to cultivate with its openness to young and emerging writers?
Sorry, what's that again?
What are some of the most unique insights Yishu has been able to cultivate with its openness to young and emerging writers?
I think part of it has been the kinds of topics that we've taken on. I mean, we've dealt with, you know, all kinds of different topics. And then, you know, I finished off with these two artists, my talk, who work outside of the urban environment. So I have been interested in some of those issues that don't really get discussed so much or acknowledged so much, because I mean the art industry is a huge industry, and it's and it is an industry at this point in which it has its own protocols, and if you want to be successful or whatever, you have to follow the rules of the industry, whereas we really were looking at a lot of issues that weren't tied into the art market or the art industry as such.
So as an editor-in-chief, how many hours do you spend on working on Yishu?
How many hours?
Yeah, how much time do you devote it?
It varies. It depends upon the complexity of the editing. I mean, it's like some texts are like totally clean and they're really easy to edit. Some of them, you know, I go through an initial edit and send it back to the writer for more work. Some are translations, and translations can be extremely difficult. And especially with Chinese, because there are, you know, proverbs and sayings that are very difficult to translate into English. And this is something Rebecca and I were talking about, how, you know, what do you do? Do you try and make this idea that is not common in the West translatable in English for an English audience? Or do you leave it a kind of a little bit awkward so that the reader knows that it can't really be translated clearly into English? So that, yeah, that's one of the difficulties. So, I mean, the number of hours, it varies. It varies on the text.
Yeah, since you mentioned about the translation between English and Chinese, what's your opinion? Do you keep the original proverb or text, even though it looks bizarre, awkward in the English context?
Yes, generally I try to. So, so an English reader might read it and think like, what is this? You know, and maybe not understand it. But as I said, that not understanding lets that English reader know that there's a way of thinking that is different from theirs and that can't actually be translated. Which I find very interesting, but
so we know that you have stepped on as editor-in-chief this year. What's your future plan and future projects?
Well, I have a whole lot of books I've got to go through. I've got papers to go through, books to read for sure. I work in my garden, and I'm working on an exhibition, and I'll probably develop some writing projects in the near future. But for me, after all these years, it's a bit of a time for reflection, and I want to take some time out to reflect on what I've written in the past. I have written for about 50 publications over the last 40 years. So I sort of want to go back and read what I wrote to find out what I was thinking. And part of the talk today was a bit of a reflection on, you know, what was I thinking when I was taking on this project of Yishu. And it's really important to do, to kind of review what one has done. You'll do that one day when you get older.
Yeah, speaking of books, what is on your shelf, and what other art publications, where, you know, publications on art criticism, even magazines, do you read?
I don't read a huge number of them because I was having to read a lot already. So, you know, just to catch up. I mean, I get a lot of things online, etc., and I read articles and. But my reading is very diverse. It goes through art criticism to automobiles, to cooking, to gardens, again back to art, history.
Let us.
I have a lot of books. See them here. This is just a small little representation of my books. They're all over everywhere.
Let us. Thank you. Yeah. Let us turn to the many questions that posed by our audience, and I'll just read through them out. Chongyi Li says, "Hello, Keith. This may be a personal question, since you have been so dedicated to and engrossed in your work at Yishu. How has your role as an editor-in-chief changed your sense of being or identity as an independent curator and as a Canadian?"
Oh, gee. I don't quite know how to answer that. I learned a lot, I will say, as being the editor, not only about contemporary Chinese art. I mean, I never ever entered this as any kind of an expert, but that it was a learning experience for me. It was a gathering of knowledge for me. And that was very important. Now that I'm not doing that, and I mentioned earlier, now I'm going into a more reflective period, you know, and, you know, I've been around for a while, for a few years, I just think it's time. I mean, you have a certain responsibility when you're doing editing or being an editor, and you have a responsibility not only to the mandate of the publication you're working for, but a responsibility to the writers. And that was actually one of the most rewarding things for me, was developing relationships with different writers, many of whom I worked with for a period of years, and really creating this community of writers who felt free to voice what it is they wanted to voice.
And Annie Z asks, is it possible to appreciate works from Chinese artists without thinking of their nationality? I find the reception of Chinese art way too political. Not sure if that's a good thing. Thanks.
You find the Chinese art?
If I find the reception of Chinese art way too political, not sure if that's a good thing.
Oh, way too political. Well, I think I mean, that's been a big discussion, because it was partially because people in the art world, especially outside of China, wanted it to be political because of the vast changes that China went through over the last, 45 years. So there was, especially when Chinese art was first being exposed internationally in the 90s, people wanted it to be political. People outside wanted it to be political for some reason. A lot of Chinese art isn't political now, or the politics might be embedded deeply within the artwork itself. So the politics don't necessarily sit on the surface or are obvious to one, but you know, it may be embedded. And I don't like, or I'm not so interested in sort of that slap you in the face kind of political art. I think it needs to be broader.
And also there's a question from Julie Chuan. She's also a frequent writer for Yishu Journal. She said, "Dear Keith, thank you for your well-developed, brilliant talk. Living in China and documenting Chinese art history as a non-Chinese Asian, I find that the rise of mega large recent museums, such as He Museum in Foshan and the Pingshan Museum in Shenzhen, are promoting what I feel is a more standardized and streamlined collection. How do you think this form of strategy problematize the future discourse on Chinese contemporary art for younger generation of viewers and writers?"
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
So how do you think this kind of a mega museum with standardized collections, how does it affect to the future discourse on Chinese contemporary art for younger generation of viewers and writers?
Well, I think that newer generation are going to have to determine their own kind of direction. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. I mean, the mega museums are important and they're great, but they're not the determinants of what contemporary art is, or contemporary art writing will be, or what contemporary art will be. Again, they're kind of like entertainment palaces in many cases. I remember actually going to the Long Museum with Julie, and we went to the show, and it was like, it was more about entertainment than about art. And I don't I'm not sure where the serious criticism comes with these larger institutions, either in the artwork or the publications that they produce. So, I mean, there's so many, especially in China, there's so many of these huge museums opening up that, it becomes like an entertainment world in a sense.
And I think one last question from our audience, Amanda. She says, thank you for your lecture, Keith. May I ask, how do you see artists such as Xu Bing, Chen Zhen, and Cai Guoqiang as Chinese?
How do I see them as Chinese? Well, they are Chinese. I mean, even though even Chen Zhen isn't alive any longer, and Xu Bing is back in China, and he lived in the States for a number of years, but they're very internationally aware, but they're Chinese at the same time. I mean, I don't, it's like, I don't know how, it's not a question of how do I see them as Chinese, they are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, and thanks for everyone who joined us. And thank you again, Keith, for your talk and your sharing with us today. And do you have any other reflections to speak about before we end our conversation today?
Well, I would just say that it's been a huge honor to be a part of Yishu and our spiritual leader, Zheng Chengtian, who has been with it all along and has been really one of the driving forces behind it. It's been a complete honor to be a part of this, and I feel that I have participated in history, and that feels really great. I mean, I can step back and think, yeah, okay, through this publication and through all the writers, I feel that I've been able to be a part of history, and that is very rewarding. It's been one of the most gratifying experiences of my life.
Wow.
So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Today's talk, we are going to post it in our exhibition space, and we also think it should not only documenting the contemporary Chinese art, and it also become part of contemporary Chinese art history. And in our exhibition space, you will be able to see the total of 100 issues. And to all of you who are interested in Yishu Journal, we'd like to let you know that we are having email interviews with other editors of Yishu and also frequent writers of Yishu. Some of them have been publishing their writing with Yishu for more than a decade. And in February, we will publish the interviews on our WeChat channel in both English and Chinese. And please follow our WeChat channel or our website, www.iom.org.cn. And Yishu, do you have anything to add?
Yes, and I just want to say, so today is our conversation today with Keith. Thank you very much again. And it's the final episode of our series of online conversations in the framework of this exhibition. And in the previous two, we talked to Zheng Shengtian, the founding managing editor. And the second one, we invited Kim Lam, who was also the editors-in-chief from 2002 to 2004. And all three conversation recordings will be presented on the walls in our exhibition space. So welcome to the museum and check it out.
Also one last announcement. This afternoon, we will hold a public lecture in our museum. The lecture is to revisit the artworks by Wei Qimei in the 1980s. He's one of our participating artists of the exhibition Waves and Echoes. This talk will be start in 2 hours. We will be streaming on Bilibili platform. So I'm posting this on the chat box. So we'd like to thank again, Keith, for your time and your sharing, and thanks to everyone who have joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
And stay safe.
Stay
I
safe.
hope it made some sense.
Really stay hydrated as well.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. Thank you again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.